I'm Danny DiCrescenzo for 88.7 FM WRHU, and I'm joined by Alex Castino, the co-executive producer of Behind the Music for Creature Film / MTV Studios. Alex, great to be with you.
Well, thanks for having me, Dan. I really appreciate it, man.
And you've been in the production industry for music since what, like 2000-ish, 1999?
I got my foot at the door at MTV in 1994. It dates back to 94, and it was really an entry-level type job. That they had this huge vault of everything that MTV, VH1, and even Nickelodeon at that time had recorded. And it was like working in a video store. Producers would come down and say, I need these tapes, and you'd grab them. But, the bonus of that is you're in the building and you're meeting people. You know what I mean? I just loved working at MTV because I was simply a music fan. And I honestly didn't know where it was going to go or where I wanted it to go. I just I needed a job, and somehow I got into building. And so, yeah, it was a few years of figuring it out before I actually got involved in production.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting when I think about my generation's relationship to music, because we have it on our phone. We can stream whatever we want when we want it. We don't have to go to a record store. How would you say your experience growing up when there was records and CDs and stuff like that influenced how you got into the music business in terms of being a producer for stuff like Behind the Music?
Yeah, much different, much different than your generation. The music industry back then, of course, there was physical copies for one, right? You guys have everything on your phone. And not only that, as a kid, vinyl albums were still the main source. When I was young, it was a bunch of Kiss and Van Halen albums, you know what I mean? Full albums. And the great thing about that is you'd get this giant cover in your face and there'd be great artwork. So you'd have a real relationship with music, as opposed to just being on the run all the time. Like everything's in your phone, right? So music is just one of a million things. But I think back then when you had an album, you actually would sit in a room and just focus on the album and look at the artwork. Another big thing was the dawn of MTV. I mean, MTV hit the air in 1981. I was 10 years old. And that was huge because it was like having this radio station that was 24/7, and you were introduced to all new types of artists and visuals. And it was great. It was really inspirational. And then growing up in New Jersey, the Meadowlands opened up, and the Giant Stadium was already there, but they opened up the Meadowlands Arena, which back then was called the Brendan Byrne Arena. And now these concerts were coming to your backyard, essentially. I mean, I grew up in Paramus, New Jersey, so that was probably 15, 20 minutes away from the arena. So I was going to see these bands that I loved. So yeah, the relationship was definitely more focused and personal. It felt kind of larger than life. I think now it still feels that way, but it's mixed in with everything else on your phone, like, TikTok and Instagram and stuff like that. And it seems to be your attention span now. I think you were kind of forced to listen and sit and pay a little bit more attention back then.
Yeah. But. So you started MTV, as you said, entry-level job, and you mentioned how MTV sort of changed the game. What did you do at MTV that may have set the stage for your career now in terms of production?
I think what happened was when as I said, my foot was in the door. The big thing for me was I was working at the library in New York, and they were in the middle of this kind of archiving project. They wanted to know, the tapes weren't labeled as good as they could be. And it was kind of a situation where they didn't know everything that they had. So there was this archiving project where we kind of hired people to watch the tapes and enter in the data that would let producers know what the network has. So that project ends, and now they said that they wanted to do it in Los Angeles, and would I be interested in going to Los Angeles for 6 months to do the same project? So I went to LA, and long story short, that project ended up lasting 2 years, and I was in the building. I was next to people who were producing shows like Behind the Music in 1997, which was first starting to be produced. And, they'd be like, you should come work for us. You can become a researcher, which is kind of like a PA. And next thing I knew, I was an associate producer, and then I was a producer. So I would say the move to Los Angeles and being around productions like Behind the Music, which I'm still working on today, all these years later, was the biggest thing probably for me.
When it comes to working in music, you have a ton of experience working with the musicians themselves. So when was your first time you actually got to sit down with a big name musician or celebrity, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is actually happening. We're talking to this person?
It was Green Day. It was the rock band Green Day, which is still a really huge band right now. So it was great, and I felt really prepared for it because I was somewhat of a fan of them for sure. And you have enough prep time to do research and really prepare for your interviews. So yeah, there is that thrill of meeting somebody famous, but at the end of the day, when you have that confidence of like, all right, I know the job that I'm supposed to do is to interview these guys and try to get to the bottom of their story. When you do the proper research and you kind of know what you're talking about, any kind of nervousness or anything like that, I felt kind of didn't went away. You know what I mean? And like I say, all those years of watching MTV as a kid and watching rock documentaries, I think helped me prepare for how to do that job. So yeah, it's thrilling to meet people that you see on TV or you hear on the radio. But what's really cool is that most people, when they get to meet a rock star, an artist, it's kind of a quick thing, right? It might be a backstage meeting. You don't really have this license to start asking them about their personal lives and their career. But with this job at Behind the Music, you kind of had that key. Like they expected you to sit there and really ask them real stuff about their lives and their career. So not only was it cool to meet a lot of the people I work with, but to actually sit with them and kind of dive in to some things musically and just overall life stuff. That's super interesting.
If you are just tuning into 88.7 FM WRHU, I'm Danny DiCrescenzo, joined by Alex Castino, the co-executive producer of Behind the Music from Creature Films / MTV Studios. I think it's interesting that you entered the scene at a really interesting time, because I've spoken to other people who work in TV and they said, reality TV at the turn of the century really changed the game for what was popular and what was not. And you're working in these segments, you're working on these docuseries. Did any sort of changes in the TV industry affect how you or your companies approached working with artists?
I think for me personally, because again, I freelance, right? So I've done a lot of work with networks like MTV and VH1 back in the day, and mostly music-based stuff. But the biggest change for me personally was when reality TV started to kind of take over, because MTV and VH1 ceased becoming music networks, and they're really not anymore, at least on television. I think now I'm working with MTV again, and our stuff is airing on Paramount Plus. So there's a real kind of push for them to be more musical. But the biggest change for me is when that reality TV stuff started to enter music television. All of a sudden, there weren't music jobs anymore. You know what I mean? There wasn't music documentaries anymore. You were following around models of socialites, and I didn't really do those jobs. I kind of pivoted and began to work directly with managers and PR people that and label people that I met on MTV and VH1 jobs, and started to independently shoot and edit. This is also the rise of like MySpace and websites having short videos, behind the scenes videos of their artists. So there was a lot of work for me to do that. And I lucked out in a sense. I wasn't working in TV as much. It was more that behind the scenes independent work for the labels or the managers. But that was a big change, because when I was at VH1 and MTV, I was still young I'm saying in the 90s and the early 2000s. And I thought, okay, I'm set. These networks are never going to change. This is a music network and I'm a music guy. And then it was a rude awakening to see this reality TV take over, not just those networks, but TV in general, and it wasn't my thing. I wasn't interested in that.
Well, I'm very glad that my TV history knowledge is solid. Reality TV changed the game, paradigm shift. And that flows into this idea of, okay, you're working with Behind the Music now, and now it's going on Paramount Plus. It's not even really going to TV. How did streaming impact this? Because you mentioned that MTV changed its identity over the years, and now the destination for music isn't even primetime television, it's a streaming service. How does streaming factor into how your work changes?
I think it really helped personally, because I think what it did, at least in the past few years, it kind of widened the content, right? It wasn't there was more room, right? So there was kind of, I think in streaming there's something for everyone. If you're a music fan, there's going to be music docs, and if you're a reality fan, there's going to be reality shows, and I think it opened up the idea of bringing back shows like Behind the Music. Look, we're also in the midst of a huge nostalgia thing too, right? That, as far as like they brought back what's that series, Cobra Kai, based on the Karate Kid. There's a lot of 80s and 90s nostalgia. So I think streaming really opened those doors for more productions like that. Because honestly, Dan, I thought Behind the Music was done. You know what I mean? I'm like, TV, that just isn't TV anymore. Like, who's going to put on Behind the Music? VH1's not going to do it anymore. They don't even play music anymore. So it did open up that door. When I got the call that it was coming back, it was like a real pleasant surprise. And I kind of attributed it all to streaming opening up more options.
Do you think music is an inherently nostalgic field to work in when you're dealing with artists who have a legacy, or even new artists who come onto the scene rapidly now?
I don't know. I mean, nostalgia is a big part of it, but it's funny because You can look on iTunes right now, and a Fleetwood Mac song, if it's on TikTok, could be in the top 10. What's old is new again because it's all there, right? It's all on the streaming service. So you can have a new album by The Weeknd, but you can also have Dreams by Fleetwood Mac being on the same charts. So I don't know. I think nostalgia is still a big part, but when I see young people enjoying older artists from my generation, I tap into it's really just about emotion. You know what I mean? It's really about the emotions that these songs conjure up. At the end of the day, people just love songs. And I think now with streaming, they don't care if it's from 30, 40, 50 years ago or a week ago. I mean, there's exceptions, of course, but I do, as an older guy, love seeing young people react to older music and really, really liking it. So yeah, and to answer your question, nostalgia is huge as you get older, especially because it is music does work as some kind of time machine. It conjures up uh, all kinds of vivid memories and emotions. But I think I don't think it's purely based in the past. I think there's also kind of current emotions that you can tap into through music. So I think emotion and nostalgia, I think, are two key things in music for me.
If you are just tuning into 88.7 FM WRHU, I'm Danny DiCrescenzo, joined by Alex Castino, the co-executive producer of Behind the Music from Creature Films / MTV Studios. All right, so we've talked about the broad strokes, talked about where you started, your feelings on music and what you do and where music TV is now. I want to get into what you actually do. So,
yeah,
walk me through a day at work working on Behind the Music.
Well, right now I'm a co-executive producer, and I'm the showrunner essentially. So I work for a company called Creature Films in Los Angeles, and it's run by a guy, Mark Ford, who I've worked with on and off for over 20 years. We met at Behind the Music when Behind the Music was in-house at VH1. So what happens is he basically hires me to run the show, hire the producers, hire the associate producers, hire the editors. And basically, to answer your question, a day at work is kind of keeping tabs on how our teams are doing. I'll have one team on a J-Lo episode. I'll have one team on a country star Jason Aldean episode. I'll have one team on a Boy George episode. I don't know if you know who Boy George is, but he made quite a stir in the '80s. He was a great artist. But anyway, I'll check in on teams, and it's a combination of logistics and creativity. You know what I mean? Making sure we have the research to make the most creative, kind of entertaining show we can. And also, there's a lot of logistics. There's a lot of clearances. Every shot that's on that screen has to be paid for. So you work with clearance teams. You work with music supervisors. So I'm sorry I don't have a direct answer, but it's kind of my job is kind of an all-encompassing management of the series. And right now we've got, for instance, 9 episodes that'll be happening at the same time. Last year we had about 20. So, a lot of meetings, and you take time to meet with certain teams and stuff like that. And then there's also the shooting aspect of it. I'll go out on shoots with the producers now. I don't do as many interviews as I used to. I will do some, but it's more like being just kind of running the shoot, making sure the shot looks good, making sure the interviewer is covering all the bases so we know what we need to go into edit and properly tell this story the way we want to tell it. So yeah, it's kind of like this large and dealing with the network. We work directly with people at MTV. We work with their talent department. We work with a lot of their executives to get on the same page. So and then with the network, there's logistics. So it's logistical and creative, but there's a lot of people to deal with. But we're managing it pretty well now. I have a great team, and that's the key. It's like to have people that you trust and know are excited about getting the job done. It cuts down on the stress level big time.
So before I get into more of the details on that, how does this differ from a docu-series with one specific focus? Because I saw you worked on The Ride with BB Rexa, and I love BB Rexa. She's actually probably my favorite.
Oh, she was cool. Yeah,
I know she is amazing. So when it comes to working on we have one specific subject and it's just one person from start to finish versus what it sounds like Behind the Music where you have multiple different teams, plenty of moving parts. What's different between those two types of endeavors?
Well, like when I was working on The Ride, I had a supervising producer role. So yes, to your point, I was more focused on, okay, this is about BB Rexa. My days will be all about BB Rexa. I'll prepare, I'll do the interview. And that's all I really have to think about is all things BB Rexa episode. But now for me, it's way different because, you have to pivot all day. You know what I mean? You can get a call. There's some problem with the J-Lo show or footage we can't clear. All right, what are we going to do? You can get what day does that artist want to do the interview? Oh, they have to change it now. Okay, we have to call a crew. There's all things that come up that you have to be involved in. But again, having a great team like I do have, I have fantastic people that really support that whole process. And the comfort in and the confidence that I have, it's like I don't have to stress about it. You know what I mean? And things come up that do get stressful because it's mostly centered around deadlines, but it always works out. You know what I mean? So a strong team, I know it's a cliche, a strong team is super important to like help me manage all being involved in everything, as opposed to just going, I'm gonna like live in BB Rex's world for a few months, you know.
That doesn't sound too bad.
Hey, it was fun. And if you're a fan, you should know she was really, really cool. She was great. I got to interview her in London. I had never been to London, and it was a great experience.
Yeah, we're gonna get to some stories you would like to share later, but when it comes to behind the music, what would you say makes a great episode of Behind the Music? How do you reveal what is, behind the music and
Hmm.
the musician?
What I like best is, well, we always try to aim for the emotional story. We really try to bring out emotions because those emotions go into the songs themselves, and those are the emotions that the audience feels when they hear those songs. Um, what I love most, what makes the best behind the music is when you have an artist that will not only tell you these amazing stories, but then the songs that they wrote at that time almost work as a diary entry. It's almost like their writing was talking either directly or slightly indirectly about the event that they're telling you about. And then you feature the lyrics. And sometimes you have people that go, I never thought of the song that way. And now I'm thinking of this song with this story that this artist is telling me. We had worked, for an example, we had worked with country artist Jason Aldean last year, and his PR person said after, you guys had got me thinking about these songs in a whole different way than I ever did. And I've been working with this guy for 15 years. So as a music fan, I love when we can tell a really great emotional story that has really great ups and downs, which is the kind of hallmark of behind the music. There's a lot of ups and a lot of downs. But when the music matches, when lyrics or tone of a song matches the mood of what this artist is telling us in interview, it's just perfect. So I think that's what makes the best behind the music. And let's face it, rock stars with tales of debauchery that doesn't hurt either. Some of those old behind the musics have some, it was a different time, and some of those rock stars lived some crazy lives. So it's certainly interesting because they lived very different lives, and I think a lot of times the viewer lives vicariously through those stories sometimes. But yeah, I think the musical connection and yeah, let's leave it at that. The musical, when we can connect the music to the story, it works the best.
If you are just tuning into 88.7 FM WRHU, I'm Danny DiCrescenzo, joined by Alex Castino, the co-executive producer of Behind the Music from Creature Films / MTV Studios. Is there a formula to try and find those stories, or does each artist have their own little way of bringing it to light within the framework of an episode or a series?
I think it's both, because the funny thing about Behind the Music, especially when it was in its prime on VH1 in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was almost like there was a template. We used to joke in the office, like, okay, there's going to be, it seemed like every Behind the Music had the rise and then the fall. The fall involved divorces, managers ripping them off, breakups, someone dying, someone getting hooked on drugs and alcohol and rehabbing, a breakup of the band, a reunion tour. It's almost seems like those story beats apply to almost every artist. It was almost like insert artist here. But that said, they each have their own interesting kind of angles on those story beats. You know what I mean? And there's certain things that make different episodes unique. But yeah, I will say there was kind of a template, and we're working on one now that I really can't dive into yet. But there were alcohol and drug problems, and that's a real thing, and that's a real story beat in Behind the Music. But what's great is we sell those low points, because at the end of the day, at the end of the episode, there's always this redemption. You know what I mean? And that's what makes the redemption take off even higher, is when you're kind of down in the dumps with the artist, and then you kind of bring it up. And it really gets down to the pacing of the episode and the pacing of the storytelling to kind of lock the viewer in. Because the greatest thing about Behind the Music that I've heard is people say, I don't even like that artist, but I watched the Behind the Music and I was really into it. And I feel like Behind the Music has that. Like, you will watch it Behind the Music because it has a reputation, even if you don't know who the artist is. Chances are you're really going to enjoy how the story's told, and maybe even like a few songs if you didn't already.
Oh, absolutely. Because you take an artist who maybe you hear oh, they went through this, or and now they're back, and they have this one or two songs that are really famous, and then you hear about them more, and you're like, oh, well, now I understand them as a human being. Do
Totally.
you do you feel like that humanizing experience is still alive and well, even like beyond your show, just in general, when it comes to musicians, there's still an act or a thrust to make these people fully human?
Yeah, I think so, because I think it has to be relatable, right? And that's why the common person watching will connect. Besides just loving the music, I think when they find out that they are just humans after all, just like all of us, and they are really, because I've met a lot of them. Now, look, they live different lives, they live different realities than most of us do. So there's idiosyncrasies they have that the common person does not have. But at the end of the day, they all go through the same human emotions. They go through the same hardships. There's family backgrounds and there's all kinds of stuff. And I think people forget that when they're on stage because that's part of it. It's kind of this you want to escape from reality. But I think when you see a show like ours behind the music, it does humanize them a bit. And I think it makes them very relatable, or as relatable as possible. And I think again, leaning into emotion, everyone can relate to emotion, you know?
Yeah. And, going off that thread, I mean, nobody really that I've seen on LinkedIn, at least I've been scanning your LinkedIn, looking at your personal website. You work with so many artists across so many different genres. So I want to dive into, just to really wrap this up, to dive into the meat of your career, just your trajectory working with these people. So you started at MTV and you said you worked a lot with VH1. You did mostly music stuff. Just talk to me briefly about your journey and just sum up your journey in a couple of paragraphs in terms of what
Yeah, I
that taught
mean,
you about this industry and working in entertainment and production.
yeah, I mean, there's been all different kinds of experiences. I think a big job for me is I got to work with Aerosmith on their Behind the Music, and that was a little bit above and beyond what we normally did at Behind the Music. So I got to go on the road. You know what I mean? I got to go to Japan, and I got to, it was like that movie Almost Famous. Where the kids got access to everything all of a sudden. Like I was on stage, I was backstage, I was. But I think what you learn, to answer your question as you go through, is, you know, um, you deal with managers and you deal with label people and you deal with PR people and you deal with glam people, and there's all kinds of teams, and it's a real community. And sometimes it's tricky to navigate, but I think at the end of the day, what I learned was if I can just be myself, you know what I mean? As long as I have the skills and be myself as this music fan that I always was growing up in New Jersey, that they don't know that maybe they get the sense that I'm not full of crap. You know what I mean? I think especially when I work with particular heroes of mine like Aerosmith or Slash from Guns N' Roses, and even people like Neil Diamond and Fleetwood Mac, I think they recognized in me that I really was this music fan. I wasn't some Hollywood person that was just looking to do this for status or name dropping. It just more, I think particularly with Slash, and Aerosmith, because they're rock bands. I think they got that I listened to them and I knew their material, and it wasn't, So I just try to lean on being myself in this world of high profile people. And at the end of the day, they're the same too. Most of them are music obsessives too. People at labels, people at MTV that I work with. We all love music, and that's why we did it in the first place. So if you just kind of stand firm on that passion, I think people can sense it. So if I learned anything, it's just kind of like stick with the passion and why you wanted to get into it in the first place.
Yeah. You mentioned your heroes. I think a lot of in our audience were, college station. We have a lot of people who probably see the list of people you've worked with, like, oh, I would love to know how they were. Is there any go-to stories about working with these people that you feel are very worthy of being told?
Well, I mean, one thing I can think of, because I know she's a big star that I think a lot of people at your school will know, is Jennifer Lopez. And Jennifer
Absolutely.
Lopez, the one thing I really admired by working with her and watching her, beyond interviewing her a few times, I got to watch her rehearse for a week straight for the VMAs. I think in 2018 she won like the Lifetime Achievement Award at the Video Music Awards. So my point is to see how hard she actually worked. I think when you see those performances or you watch that Super Bowl halftime show she did, you're definitely aware of the talent. But I think seeing them consistently work on it and the care that went into it, I gained a lot of respect for her work. And look, I'm a rock and roll guy. I can't say I'm cranking J-Lo on my iTunes, in my car. It's definitely not in my wheelhouse musically, but I started liking a lot of the songs and really, and I can say this about a lot of artists, I come away liking them more. You know what I mean? If it's not like a Slash or an Aerosmith that they already won me over as a teenager, if I'm going into a project where it's not necessarily my musical wheelhouse, I find something like that JLo story to kind of inspire me and think really highly of them. I don't have many negative stories. I have a couple, and I'd rather not share them. But for the most part, everybody has had me has had me walking away feeling very inspired and kind of like respectful of their careers because they work and they care. It's a lot of work actually for someone like Jennifer Lopez.
If you are just tuning into 88.7 FM WRHU, I'm Danny DiCrescenzo, joined by Alex Castino, the co-executive producer of Behind the Music from Creature Films / MTV Studios. How would you define your job? Is your job to really showcase that there's a lot more behind the scenes that we don't see? That's just like a great halftime show. There's so much going into it that you don't see, but maybe behind the music can show you this is someone's entire life leading up to that moment. And this is what it is.
I think so, but it's changed over time because now in the internet age, because you got to remember when Behind the Music started, I guess the internet was just kind of starting too. It was like late 90s. Now things behind the curtain don't seem as special anymore because it's just everywhere, right? It's on YouTube. Artists will release they'll have a videographer on tour, and you get to see a lot of that stuff now. And it's shot very well. And, I think now, though, to define what we try to do is like what I was talking about before. How can we tell this story that's so engaging that even a person who doesn't care about this artist at all is going to be interested and stick around and might even start to get into a few of the songs and maybe reconsider that artist? Because that happens to me. Like I say, like I are involved in some of these episodes that I'm not necessarily a fan of the artist going in, but I walk away with something from it, and I think that's really what we're trying to do. And it's really, again, if we tap into emotion the right way, it can work pretty easily with artists because everyone can relate to that,
Yeah. And just in terms of, we have a lot of people at our communication school who are interested in production, music, or both. What would you say is probably the best piece of advice you could give to somebody who wants to follow in your footsteps and work with artists, work as a producer, and really follow these people and follow this industry?
Well, I mean, it may sound kind of cliche and basic, but don't underestimate the foot in the door aspect of things. You know what I mean? I think a lot of times you may have a lot of dreams and you may be really skilled at shooting or editing or producing or whatever already, or think you are. But if you get an opportunity to kind of get in a building and maybe you're grabbing coffee or maybe you're just doing a lot of paperwork, don't underestimate it, because at the end of the day, you're around people that are going to lead you to exactly where you want to be. So, yeah, I would say any opportunity you can to be around people that are actually doing it, even if it's a role that requires some patience, I would take it and learn. And other than that, just keep your passion for it. I think passion is everything. If you have passion, I think it'll find a way to happen somehow. Because let me tell you, man, I'm not a goal-oriented type of person. It's just not my personality. I didn't come to LA thinking, oh, I'm going to come to LA and I'm going to become, I didn't know. I still didn't know what I was going to do. All I know is that MTV offered me this extension on a job and I took it. And it was all about meeting people. And then it's like, oh, can you shoot? I'm like, well, yeah, my dad used to have that VCR camera. I guess and then all of a sudden you're shooting and you learn along the way. So yeah, don't underestimate the foot in the door.
Last question. We began this interview with MTV. You said it changed the game when it came out, and then reality TV came around. That changed things, and now you're working for MTV, but it's for a streaming service. We talked about how young people are exposed to old artists in a lot of weird ways. It's because on new social media, old songs become relevant again. I mean, Running Up That Hill is probably the best example. Yeah. How do you think, from your perspective, the music industry, how people engage with it, how people engage with projects like Behind the Music or documentaries you've done in the past will change in the next couple, years or maybe even decades? Is there a change that you want to maybe make a prediction about right now and hope you're right sometime soon?
Well, I mean, I don't know about prediction, but I definitely see things trending in the sense of people's attention spans are shorter than they used to be. You know what I mean? Because we've got phones and, I think it'll continue on the trend of what I said, where it's not really going to matter what era it comes from. I think a song could be discovered after many years sitting, and it's been sitting there for 40 years. I think like Running Up That Hill is a great example. The people my age have always loved that song. And now all you do is put it in this super dramatic scene on Stranger Things, and you've got 7 and 8-year-old girls covering it. I mean, that blew my mind because Kate Bush is not, even back in the 80s, she was more of a, I guess what you would call it like an alternative artist. You know what I mean? She had a few hits, but it wasn't like It wasn't like Madonna or, or something huge like that in this country anyway. So I think it'll continue that way. I think the idea of what's old can be new again simply because it's on the same platform. And all it takes is some music supervisor to put it in a show, or some crafty TikTok user to put it in their video while they're drinking ocean spray cranberry juice on a bicycle. That was the Fleetwood Mac. That's how the Fleetwood Mac song became popular. So I don't. I think it's going to stay in that short attention span range, and I think anything goes. I think you can have a song from the 1973 that can all of a sudden be at the top of the charts at some point.
And once again, that was Alex Castino, co-executive producer of Behind the Music. Alex, thanks again.
It was a pleasure, Dan. It was great talking to you, and I really appreciate your interest in my career. So thanks again.